Welcome back to Audio Fanfics. Today we're reading Love and All Its Meanings. 6 months after Tony snaps his fingers, he wakes up. Peter isn't there when he does. He's in his apartment with May, trying to piece their lives back together when he gets Happy's call. 15 minutes later, he and May are on the way to the private hospital where Tony has been kept safe while in his coma. Peter barely remembers the ride there, even less the thoughts that cross his mind. He does remember May speaking to him, but the words are muddled and thick with emotion. When May parks the car, Peter almost collapses when he opens the door, his legs shaking like he'd never used them before. Grasping May's arm for balance and comfort, they walk up towards the building. Happy greets him at the entrance of the hospital, haggard and jittery. He regards Peter with a gaze that is disbelief, hope, and fear all rolled into one. Peter lets go of May's arm to collapse into Happy's. Peter wraps his arms around the man's midsection as best he can, squeezing to the point where he's sure it's painful. Happy weathers it and simply hugs Peter back. After a few breaths, Happy releases Peter, offers May a small smile, and turns towards the automatic doors. Peter feels heavy with a slew of undefinable emotions as he and May follow Happy through the maze of hallways to Tony's room. The trio are met with the figure of Pepper Potts leaning at the threshold of the door. She looks exhausted, her auburn hair knotted against her head, a far cry from her usual composure. She looks like she just woke up, dark circles under her eyes, and clothed in purple sweatpants and a black AC/DC shirt that's only slightly too big on her. She watches they approach, and as they get closer, Peter sees that she's dangerously close to crying. But there's something in her teary eyes that Peter hasn't seen since Tony's sacrifice. Like finally, something in her soul was at peace. Her small smile solidifies it. "He's not really lucid yet," she says in lieu of a greeting as they come to a Nancy stop just shy of the door she seems to be guarding. "But he's semi-conscious." "Can we see him?" Peter asks, his voice small and shaking. May squeezes his upper arm. "Once the doctors are done doing their checks," Pepper promises, looking at the covered window. She fiddles with her wedding ring on her finger. She heaves a breath, and another wet smile graces her mouth. "He opened his eyes." May gives a sigh of relief, and Peter feels one of Happy's hands land on his shoulder. Peter is shaking under Happy's careful grasp, staring at the door. He isn't sure what he's waiting for. He's not sure of much. The only thing he's sure of right now is Tony woke up. Tony's awake. "Should I call Jim?" Happy asks Pepper, and Peter feels his thumb press into his shoulder, a gesture of comfort. Peter releases a breath, and the next one in is a little easier. She contemplates it for a moment, hesitant, then suddenly she deflates ever so slightly, like the high of her joy had settled into something more back down to earth. Peter notices the change, and he feels the weight of his anxiety shift. Now, to his utmost horror, he feels like leaving. He draws a sharp breath that no one seems to notice. "I don't want to get Morgan's hopes up," Pepper sighs. It's as if she's preparing for Atlas to lose his hold on her world again. Happy shrugs, a guise of nonchalance, ignoring her implications, but he does squeeze Peter's shoulder again before letting it go. The spot aches in his absence, and Peter feels a knot build in his throat. "Jim and I can trade places. I don't mind watching the little monster." Pepper lifts her gaze to him, and they exchange some sort of silent conversation before she smiles again, though the shape is a little more brittle than it was before. "Thank you, Happy," she whispers. Peter feels Happy's hand on his shoulder again, and he lets Happy turn his body to face both him and May. Peter looks Happy dead in the eyes, trying his best to keep himself from breaking down right there in the hallway. "Hey," Happy says, moving his hand to clasp at the back of Peter's neck. He leans down a little, and it makes Peter feel like a child again. He's surprised to find it comforting. "Give Boss a hi for me," Happy says, and Peter can't miss the redness in his eyes and cheeks. Surprisingly, there's little fear in his eyes, like he has all the trust in the world everything will be okay. Peter doesn't trust his voice, but he manages a nod. Happy squeezes his neck twice before releasing him, standing straight and turning towards May. They exchange a tight hug, and Peter doesn't miss the feather-like kiss he presses against his aunt's temple. They release, and Happy turns towards the corridor, down the way they'd come. He vanishes around the corner. May then turns her attention to Peter, wrapping him up in a hug. He melts into it easily, and presses his nose into her neck. She presses her palms into his back and sighs softly. "How are you feeling, baby?" Peter feels another surge of emotion assault his throat, and a hard tremor runs through his form. He feels a third hand press against his lower back, and instantly knows it's Pepper. He opens his mouth to say something, but only a weak wheeze comes out. May's arms tighten around Peter, and Pepper embraces the pair of them. For a few blessed moments, Peter really feels comforted and loved, and truly at peace. Someone moves, though, shifts slightly in the tangle of limbs, and reality slams into him, and everything rushes back. He tries again, his voice a terrible rasp. He swallows the emotion further in his throat and tries again. I don't know. That's okay, Pepper reassures. There's a lot going on, and a lot could still happen. But he woke up, and that already means a lot. I've been avoiding him, Peter admits, though he's sure they're both aware of that already. Their embrace gets impossibly tighter. He breaks down then, the sudden and heavy weight of guilt crushing over his head. He chokes on his breath, and if it weren't for May and Pepper, he would have collapsed in a miserable pile on the tile floor of the hospital. Oh, Peter, it's all right, May soothes gently, rubbing her hands across his shoulder blades. No one blames you for wanting to stay away. Morgan hasn't seen him once, Pepper says, and Peter can feel the weight to the words. I'd want her to have good memories of him, you know. She pauses for a moment, gathering herself. Just in case. Peter nods, and he'll admit it made him feel a little more seen. It doesn't override the agony, though. I still should have visited, he mumbled miserably. You're here now, Pepper reassures, and Peter moves away from May's neck just enough to see the sincerity in Pepper's steady gaze. And that's all that matters. There's a soft click as the door that leads to Tony's room opens. Peter wills himself not to jolt at the sound, and both May and Pepper untangle themselves from him. May tucks Peter into her side, as if he wasn't 3 inches taller than her, and they watch as Pepper greets the doctor and the nurses that emerge from the room. Virginia, the doctor greets, opening her arms and giving Pepper a quick hug. Peter thinks he recognizes the doctor, but behind her mask and covered head, it's hard to tell. Helen, Pepper breathes, and they release, though Pepper grasps the doctor's gloveless hands with a vivid intensity. She doesn't need to say anything. He's going to wake up, the doctor, Helen, says, and something inside Peter finally uncoils. May must feel it, because she leans into him ever so slightly. Pepper nods vigorously and drops her gaze. One of her hands goes to her mouth, and her shoulders curl upwards. It's clear that the tears that were brewing in her gaze are finally starting to fall. Peter doesn't realize he's crying until he tries breathing in, finding it difficult. May sniffles beside him. He's still going to be on the ventilator for a while longer, Helen continues, just to make sure his lungs are strong enough. We'll have to run some more PET scans to ensure everything is healing as it should. You and I will talk later about setting up a surgery date, just to tie up any loose ends concerning his arm. His arm? Peter finds himself sighing, though he can already guess well enough what she means. Helen looks up at him from where she was talking to Pepper, and he can see her eyes crinkle in something that may have been a small smile. His right arm had to be amputated, she says gently. The gauntlet essentially fried it when he snapped. As if Peter could forget. Helen turns her gaze back to Pepper. If we may, I'd like to consult with you about a few things before we could begin moving forward. Sure, of course, Pepper says, her voice barely a breath. With that, the pair of them walk away, down towards where Peter assumes are empty sitting areas. The nurses around the door begin to disperse, except for one who moves to stand in front of Peter and May. She beams at them like there's absolutely nothing to be afraid of. She reminds Peter of the lunch lady at school who has a gap in her front teeth and always calls him baby. He likes this nurse. You two can go see him if you'd like, she says, laying a gentle hand on Peter's left wrist. He's sedated right now, but I'm sure he'd appreciate the company. Thank you so much, May says with a smile. We really appreciate all you've done for him. He brought my daughter back to me, the nurse says with such a powerful sense of gratitude it shoots Peter to his core. It was the absolute least I could do. He's a fighter. Peter and May both nod and smile, and the three of them turn towards the door. The nurse puts her hand on the handle, pauses for a moment, and then turns back to him, her face slightly more drawn than it was before. I'll let you know, it'll be startling to see him hooked up to so many machines. But I promise you that it's normal. In a few weeks' time, he'll be off of most of them. May seems to take the information in stride. The nurse and her are used to seeing these kinds of things. Peter is a little more uneasy, and he's suddenly, viscerally reminded of why he stayed away for so long. He feels his heart pounding in his chest as the nurse opens the door. Peter and May follow her inside. The room is fairly dark, illuminated only by a few strips of LED lights. In the corner of the room, by a window that looks over a small expanse of New York suburb, is Tony. Laying in a bed, surrounded by oh so many machines and wires, makes Peter queasy. If Peter didn't know better, he'd think he was dead. The clicks of the ventilator and the steady beats of the heart monitor fill the room with the promise of life. And, just beneath the wheeze of Tony's beaten lungs, is the wonderfully irregular sound of his heart. Peter's breath catches in his throat. Tony's alive. Really, actually alive. Peter must have spoken out loud, because the nurse gives a small chuckle. And I'm sure he'll be chattering away at us the moment he's able to. A breathy laugh escapes Peter at that. A moment passes, and Peter steels himself, moving away from May and stepping closer towards the bed. His heart sinks as Tony comes better into focus. While he may be alive and more or less awake, he doesn't look good. The skin around his eyes looks bruised and dark. His skin around his mouth looks dry, and the tape that's sticking to his face irritates the skin under it. The tubes that come from his mouth are sickening to look at, but it pales in comparison to the scarring on his face and neck. Thankfully, the wounds themselves look healed, no blood or bruises visible anymore, but the white tendrils that crawl just beneath the surface of his skin are almost otherworldly. If Peter looks closely, he swears he can see hints of vivid color tinging the edges of the darker patches of skin that mar his face, colors that remind Peter of the stones. He blinks hard, struggling to swallow the lump in his throat. Then Peter notices Tony's right arm. It's hard to spot through the tangle of tubes and sprawl of hospital fabrics and blankets, but there's an empty space tucked into Tony's side where his arm should be. Peter futilely looks across Tony's chest, distantly, stupidly hoping that maybe he had tucked his arm towards his torso, like Peter knows Tony does when he's nervous. But the curve of his chest is normal, and the space at his side is empty. Like I said, the nurse says from behind him, her voice loud against the ventilator's clicks. He looks worse than he is. When will I be able to talk to him? Peter asks, unable to take his eyes off his mentor. You can talk to him now, Pete, May offers. When Peter looks back at her, she just shrugs at him. Can't do any harm. Peter turns his eyes back on Tony and sighs. I guess not. He moves to sit in a chair next to Tony's bed. He settles down, but he can't think of anything to say. His brain is on a loop, and none of the thoughts are discernible. He grimaces and elects to stay quiet, smothering the urge to clutch Tony's hand that isn't there. There's a call button on the wall, the nurse says, her voice further away, probably at the door now. Peter can feel May's presence beside him. Just push it if you need someone. With that, she leaves the room and shuts the door gently behind her. Peter leans his head against May's hip, closing his eyes with the sensation of her running a hand through his hair. He's going to be okay, May comforts. He'll wake up, and then the two of you will be giving me and Pepper heart attacks again in no time. Peter huffs a laugh, but it's more of a polite gesture than anything. His lungs are heavy. I missed him so much, he whispers. Why doesn't I visit? Peter, May admonishes gently, her hand pausing in his hair. If you think even for a moment that Tony would blame you for not visiting, you're wrong. He loves you. He'll understand. A pang of fear strikes through Peter, and he shoots his eyes back up to look at his aunt. Please don't tell him. May's eyes harden ever so slightly, and the fear that had bloomed oh so quickly in Peter's soul is just as quickly extinguished. The hand that was in his hair moves up to cup his cheek. He rubs the thumb under his eye. He loves you, Peter, she repeats. He nearly died for you. Nothing you do or say will ever change how he feels about you. Peter sniffles and looks down at his hands clasped in his lap. I wish he hadn't. Almost died for me. I don't deserve that. I would, May says, and he wrenches his eyes shut. I would die for you. Don't say that, Peter breathes. Please. May sighs, and Peter thinks she had conceded. Then she pulls his face back up to meet her eyes, and Peter knows whatever she says now will be the end-all be-all. You would die for Morgan, wouldn't you? Peter pauses and stares at May, wondering if he heard her right. Of course I would, Peter says, incredulous. She's her child. But if it were between her and someone else's child, May presses, and Peter knows this is an argument he won't win. You'd protect her. Peter knows the answer, and it's with a resolute nod of his head that his shoulders droop and his mind clears just a little. Morgan's your sister, Peter, May whispers, and her hand goes back to his scalp. You would die for her the same way Tony almost did for you. Beat passes, and Peter offers a small laugh. I'd wish he'd stop doing that shit. May allows it as Peter hears her smile. Fair enough. Pepper comes into the room about half an hour later. She seems a little more put together as she comes to sit in the chair beside Peter, scooting close to her husband. She puts her hand gently on what remains of his right shoulder, her thumb moving back and forth across the thin fabric of the hospital gown. "What did Dr. Cho say?" May asks after a few moments, half sitting on one of the armrests on Peter's chair. He presses against her best he can. Pepper nods and tugs a strand of loose hair behind her ear. She's optimistic. She said after he goes through physical therapy, he'll be more or less himself again. More or less? Peter parrots, with a pang of unease. Pepper is quick to placate, though. She just means he'll have to get used to living life with 3 limbs instead of 4. Though, knowing Tony, he'll figure something out. Peter huffs a smile, and May does as well. Pepper continues. He'll also have to be on medication. Hill isn't sure what he'll need quite yet, but it's just to keep things moving smoothly for the foreseeable future. More doctor's appointments that he'll for sure bitch and moan about, the usual stuff. Is she at all concerned about the damage the Gauntlet's gamma radiation did? May asks after a beat, hesitant. Like, cellularly. You're asking if he's more susceptible for cancer? Pepper says, and Peter can't even fathom how much he wishes that wasn't a possibility. Pepper sighs. It's hard to say, which is why she'll have tons of specialists on hand as he starts to come back around. She said that the surgeons removed all the abnormal cells they could detect, which were located almost exclusively in his arm, but these things aren't guaranteed. Anyone could have cancer. But he'll be okay, right? Peter murmurs, and he knows that nobody has the answer for that kind of question right now. Well, there may never be an answer. But just for a moment, Peter wants to slip into the childhood comfort of trusting the adults around him to know life's answers, no matter how naive it is. And thankfully for Peter, both Pepper and May seem to understand. Helen believes that Tony should be able to live the rest of his life to the absolute fullest, Pepper says, and she smiles, a shape that Peter can find no misery in, no matter how hard he looks. He notices her fingers brush against the bare patch of scarred skin on Tony's neck, feather-light and gentle. And I trust her with that. May presses gently against Peter, and he leans into her in response. The sound of Tony's mechanical breaths fills the empty air. Peter comes every day after that. Just like the nurse had promised, the machines that were used to keep him alive start to dwindle in number. The heart monitor and the ventilator remain, along with an IV drip and a catheter, but that's about it. His blood starts to flow better. The fluid in his lungs evaporates, relinquishing Tony of that awful wheezing, and his eyes start to move under his eyelids. Peter's alone in the room with Tony when he witnesses that last part. It's the 12th day since Tony was relieved of his comatose status. Colonel Rhodes had visited a few times, and Happy had as well. May only visited twice more with Peter. She still had work shifts to take care of. Pepper seemed like she never left, and maybe she hadn't. Peter knew that Colonel Rhodes and Happy were taking shifts watching Morgan, who still wasn't able to see her dad, but Peter wondered if Pepper hadn't been home since Tony had woken for the first time. Peter also saw another boy walk out of the room once, tall and lanky, with sandy, curly hair. The boy regarded Peter with a short nod before passing him in the hallway and leaving. Peter didn't think he recognized him. Tony had woken up a few times since Peter's first visit. Peter had nearly thrown himself into a frenzied panic when he saw Tony's eyes squint open for the first time. Peter had tried getting his mentor's attention, but even as Peter's words grew more frantic, Tony's eyes remained cloudy and dull. He had seemed to struggle a moment with the tube shoved down his throat, trying to swallow and fight the steady clicks of the ventilator. He'd given up pretty quickly, though, and passed out again before Peter could call a nurse. The next few times, Peter somewhat knew what to expect from Tony. I.e., not much. So when Tony wakes up on the 12th day, Peter doesn't get his hopes up. Peter's sitting on its established hospital chair next to Tony's bed, scrolling mindlessly through his phone on one hand. The other hand is curling into the sheets of the bed, still subconsciously searching for a hand to hold on to. The sun is starting to set outside the New York skyline. Something in the bed shifts. A minute tremor. A small change of energy. Something Peter can sense in the marrow of his bones. He looks up from his phone to gaze at Tony's face. He's slightly taken aback when he notices the crease between his mentor's eyebrows. It almost looks like concentration. Peter clicks his phone off and sets it on the table next to the bed, never taking his eyes off of Tony. Curious more than concerned. The crease deepens, and Peter notices Tony's eyes moving underneath his eyelids, almost like he's dreaming. Maybe that's what's happening, Peter considers. It's only a few more seconds until Tony's eyebrows lift, like he's trying his absolute hardest to open his eyes. It seems like his eyes pop open for a flash, barely a moment in time, before he groans around the tubes, and the crease returns to his forehead. Peter's breath catches. He leans ever so slightly closer, watching Tony's face become more and more animated by the second. Mr. Stark? He tries, his voice a rasp. Tony seems to take a pause, and the lines on his face soften a little. His head twitches before Peter, but the movement is so quick and tiny, Peter isn't sure it happened. "It's Peter," Peter says, his voice barely a breath. "You're okay. I'm okay. Everything is okay." The words seem to do something, because Tony's eyelids start to flutter open, barely a hint of movement. His eyelashes stick together, and he has to blink a few times to get them to untangle. The sliver of Tony's eyes that Peter can see are brighter and more lucid than Peter has seen from them in the past week and a half. They aren't quite the vibrancy Peter's used to seeing from his mentor, but the change is drastic enough for Peter to feel an invisible weight lift from his shoulders. Tony turns his gaze and his eyes settle on Peter, and, this time, Peter can see recognition bloom in the dark of Tony's irises. Tony can see Peter. "Hey," Peter smiles, and suddenly he can't see through the wash of tears in his eyes. "That was one hell of a nap, sir." Peter isn't sure if Tony quite understands what he's saying, but it's vividly clear that Tony is finally hearing and seeing Peter, and that's enough. Tony blinks again, and his eyes open a little wider. The dry skin at the corners of his lips pulls slightly outwards, and it's a few seconds until Peter realizes Tony's trying to smile. Peter's own smile is growing wider when he notices Tony's expression changes. Peter's grin drops a little when the shift happens, the crease reappearing between Tony's eyebrows. Tony makes another noise, a hollow sort of sound that vibrates against the tubing. The sound must startle him, because there's a violent burst of panic that ignites in Tony's eyes, and he gasps. The ventilator makes an odd sound, almost like a compressed hiss as its beat is thrown off rhythm. It gets back on its track for a second before Tony forces a breath again, causing the machine to protest. Tony makes another desperate sort of sound as he fights the ventilator, his teeth grinding against the plastic. He can't get a breath. "Mr. Stark, hey, stop," Peter says, his voice still a whisper, though he knows it may not be for long. He reaches out for a hand and grasps the top of Tony's shoulder. "It's just a ventilator. You need to stop trying to breathe." Tony has the audacity to look incredulous at Peter's demand, and at any other time it would be hilarious, but Tony is panicking, which is decidedly not great. Tony's next struggling breath seems to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, because something in the ventilator's machinery grinds, clicks, and an alarm goes off. It's an incessant beeping, and though it's not loud enough to be piercing, it is to gather attention. It must freak Tony out even more, because he flinches, screws his eyes shut, and his rigid body bleeds tension. Peter's trying to stay calm, because he can tell nothing is truly, actually wrong, but seeing someone else in distress, especially someone like Tony, doesn't bode well for Peter's anxiety either. "Tony," Peter tries again, and he can hear footsteps thundering down the hallway, closer to the room. "Tony, you're okay. I promise you're okay. Stop fighting it. You're okay." Peter's not sure if the words do anything, because a swarm of nurses descend on Tony's bed, and he's gently guided out of the way. Dr. Cho's at the helm, gesturing to the personnel at her side and to the machines. Peter can barely see around their bodies, but the alarm on the machine turns off. "Is there a system leak?" Dr. Cho asks one of the nurses, as she and another doctor crowd around Tony's head and torso. Peter's insides twist when Tony releases another scared groan. "Ventilator is functioning normally," the nurse responds after examining the machine and pressing a few buttons. "No signs of pneumothorax or PE," Dr. Cho says. "Complexion is okay. Might be agitation. He seems to be steady enough to breathe on his own. Someone get me a bag, and let's extubate him." "Mr. Parker." Someone grabs Peter's arm. Peter doesn't startle, per se, but it's a near thing. He looks at the nurse who grabbed him. He sounds like he maybe said Peter's name a few times. His features are drawn and tired under his mask. "Why don't you step outside while we get Mr. Stark situated?" Peter has to force himself to focus on the nurse in front of him and not the action at his back. The nurse squeezes his arm again, and Peter nods and looks down, letting the nurse guide him out the door, the bustle of medics muffling as the door shuts. The nurse sits Peter down on the bench across the hallway from the door, giving him a half-hearted pat on the forearm. "We'll let you know when he's ready," the nurse promises before moving away and walking back into the room. The door clicks shut. Or, no, maybe he wishes it were better, because he startles when he feels a new hand drop onto her shoulder. Something in his neck pulls as he whirls to look at the newcomer. Pepper gives an apologetic smile and sits down on the bench beside him. She still looks tired, but she doesn't look unsure anymore, not like she had been on the first day. It's almost normal. "Sorry, sweetheart. Didn't mean to scare you," she says, turning her gaze to look at the door. She gives an odd, sort of endearing grimace. "My husband causing trouble?" Peter glances at her to gauge her words, but she doesn't sound upset or scared. Maybe she had known something Peter hadn't. Maybe she knew Tony was supposed to wake up. He doesn't feel like asking, though, so he just shrugs. You could say that. Pepper doesn't push much further than that. She just gathers one of Peter's hands between her own and holds it tightly. Something unwinds in Peter, and his shoulders relax. The gesture is small, but Peter is soothed by it. "He was scared," Peter admits, and Pepper squeezes his hand gently. "I'm not sure he knows what's happened. Probably not. Pepper agrees quietly, and Peter tries to block out the shuffling of the doctors behind the door. But that's why he's so damn lucky to have you here. Peter frowns and looks at Pepper. He has you. Pepper just smiles her soft smile, and her eyes are deeply sincere. You, darling, are tangible proof that everything he fought for went right. She pauses, and Peter can sense a wave of emotion wash over her. Pepper shifts in her seat slightly, and tugs on Peter's hand so it's almost to her chest. Peter can feel her heartbeat pulse through the air. He was so ready to die to make sure that you lived, Pepper says. Her voice is thick with the shadow of potential future that wasn't hers. Peter pities a universe where Tony never came home, and for him to see that you're here and breathing will mean everything to him. Peter contemplates her words for a moment, and he offers her a tiny smile. He's lucky to have you too, Mrs. Potts. And Morgan. And everyone. I'm glad he has people to come back to. Me too. Pepper agrees, and she moves one of her hands from Peter's to clasp at the back of his head. She pulls him closer, and he closes his eyes as she kisses him softly on his forehead. Me too. Peter can feel May's presence behind. Peter can feel May's presence beside him. The nurse says from beside him. The nurse says from behind him. In a few weeks' time, he'll be off for most of them. Peter is shaking under Happy's careful grasp. It's hard to say, which is why she'll have tons of specialists on hand as she starts to... It's hard to say, which is why she'll have tons of specialists on hand as he starts to come back around.